Good morning and welcome to Blain's Morning Porridge on October 30th, 2025. This is the video version. What did the Korea summit really mean for markets? As always, I like to start with a quote. So this morning, come not between the dragon and his wrath. I'll explain the significance of that one later. This morning's meeting in Busan, Korea was short and sweet. Goal achieved. The global meltdown that would have followed a rare earth embargo by China has been avoided. And what's even more interesting, how it could change the current power setup in Washington as Scott Bessent and Marco Rubio increasingly take centre stage. Anyway, we had two events and one big question for global markets to consider this morning. The first is what really happened in Busan, South Korea. The second is, what did the Fed tell us about the path of US interest rates? But the big question is, what do they collectively tell us about global power and influence? Now, the noise from the Trump-Xi meeting in Korea was exactly as expected. There was de-escalation of trade war rhetoric, including port charges levied on shipping. There was a one-year trade deal, a ceasefire in the offing. Tariffs were cut to 10%. Agreement was apparently reached that China will hold back on rare earth export controls while the US scales back export bans on advanced chips. China will buy soya beans, sparing US farmers from bankruptcy. Now, a full summit is planned in Beijing next year, followed by a visit to DC. Thus spake Trump. I would actually love to know what Xi thought of the meeting. Now, the apparent agreement was all pretty much as already negotiated by Trump's adult-in-the-room Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. As such, it's all positive for a less destabilised global trading system, although there are still plenty of things left to be ironed out, like Russian oil and Ukraine. Generally, markets should like the agreement this morning. However, the optics of the summit looked less than convincing. Trump stood there waiting to greet his great chum with charm, flattery, and lashings of schmooze. He piled on the compliments, and Xi barely acknowledged any of it. He made a very smart and clever grown-up speech about frictions and relationships, which emphasized that this was a meeting of equals. And there are very few people who do that with Trump. But his body language, that's Xi's body language, looked like a man who was there in necessary but distasteful toleration mode when dealing with Trump. Now, none of that actually matters that much. The die have already been cast. It was a brief 90-minute meeting and no communique afterwards. Trump flew straight back on Air Force One back to Washington. Xi, on the other hand, went to meet all the other Asian leaders at the conference, and that tells you a lot about what the future is going to be like. Xi's ambition for China is to lead the global economy as a very minimum, the regional economic and military hegemon in Southeast Asia. That's where the new nexus of global wealth is. Now, where will that leave MAGA America, focused primarily on the American hemisphere? So what's the upside? Now, it was the USA that needed this morning's summit. Bessent's objective had always been to minimize the market damage that further disruption that a de facto rare earth embargo would do to US markets' confidence in the economy was critical, and that meant persuading Trump to completely roll back the trade war tariff threats and be accommodating. Bessent and the other thinkers in the US cabinet are acutely aware of just how vulnerable the US AI build-out and rearmament plans are. The rush to do deal with allies on new rare earth projects, like in Australia this week, highlight how US politics might be getting back on track. Now, I take the most positive signal from the meeting is to confirm that the White House is evolving. The Trump factor is becoming less. His power to shock, destabilize, and unsettle us is diminishing because that's what we now expect of him. He no longer surprises us. Now, Treasury head Scott Bessent, together with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, are emerging as the real power and leadership in the evolving Trump administration. Now, I suspect that Trump himself is pivoting to focus on his legacy. He seems to get it and know that succession is inevitable, given his recent comments about how the very capable Rubio and his Vice President J.D. Vance should stand together in 2028. And that brings me to this morning's quote, and I'll offer anyone extra points who spots the significance of it. Quite how Marco Rubio, as potential president, will play with Vance's sponsors, that's Thiel, Ackerman and Dreesen and others in the billionaire set, is going to be very interesting. Clearly they'd all love to see Vance in the job. After all, they spent millions supporting Trump and paid him effectively to put Vance into that VP seat. Rubio may be far too independently minded for their liking. And of course, any succession talk is going to set the dogs a-running in DC. Trump's ongoing support for Bessent and Rubio is always going to be vulnerable to the whomever spoke to him last factor that seems to colour his every thinking. His solid support for the two of them will be critical during any transition, but MAGA hardliners and Trump loyalists will fight tooth and nail against practical men like Bessent and Rubio. For instance, it's interesting that Trade Secretary Howard Lutnick has pretty much vanished from the scene and was not seriously engaged in the China discussions. Now, one thing that's worth bearing in mind is what's going on itself in America. I try not to listen to the utter BS that you hear or read on X, Twitter, but you could get a change much sooner than we think. More than a few US people that I speak to, and admittedly many of these people are Democrats, are pressing me about Trump's increasingly bizarre interventions and rambling speeches. I'm told the thing to do is to watch his gait, the way he walks, for signs that conspiracy rumours about his health are not just idle speculation. All of which leads us to yesterday's 25 basis point rate cut by the Fed. As we all know, Jay Powell is under the cosh to ease and ease faster, and the whole independence of the Fed is under threat. Now, that may become much less of an issue if Trump is seen to be mellowing and allowing people like Rubio and Bessent take over. If he hands over the administration to these guys, these not particularly loyal but very competent lieutenants, then we've got much less to worry about. Although there's been much talk about how lower rates will boost the market, and yes, they will, Powell's comments about a slower pace of cuts until they see more data did cause a minor sell-off yesterday. Yet the reality is US rates are already in the sweet spot for the economy. During QE, quantitative easing, we demonstrated that pitching rates too low simply triggered investment away from the real economy into financial assets, and that's because money was too cheap. Rates around 3.5% to 4%, where they are now, should drive investment into the real economy. So my conclusion on the Korea summit is it's not too bad a picture this morning. But there are still plenty of other things that could still derail markets. I'll be back with another vlog in the very near future, and in the meantime you can get the morning porridge delivered directly to your email every morning on www.morningporridge.com, where you can sign up, and there's also a podcast available. Thanks very much, and I'll be back with a Halloween special tomorrow.